Welcome to our discussion on numerical and graphical representations, i.e. tables and charts. We're also going to learn some what-if analysis. In Excel, we're going to learn how to hold cells in place when we kind of do dynamic um, formulas. All right, so we're going to return to our example of the car loan that we had from our previous video, where we borrowed $15,000 at 6% monthly for 5 years, and we had a monthly payment of $289.99. And like I did at the end of that video where I said, well, what happens if we want to have a different APR or a different number of years? We could just change these two numbers to get different payments. But rather than have to do that kind of by hand as far as type those things in, we can set up a table that will do all that for us. So in this table, we can see at 1% interest for 1 year, this is how much our monthly payment would be, and at 3% for 1 year, it would be this, and so on and so forth. So let's see how we can actually create that table. Now, the big thing to pay attention to here is we have to worry about when we want to have absolute cell references and relative cell references. And those are just fancy ways of saying, are we going to use the dollar sign or not to lock things into place? And because certain things are going to be locked into place, certain things will have those dollar signs and other things. Now, since we're going to base this table on kind of the starting numbers up here, but then also with the different pieces that are going to be down in this in these two kind of rows and columns. And I'll show you a bigger example here in a second. We want to figure out, what's going to change and what's not going to change. Since the principal and number of compounds, whether it's monthly and whatnot, doesn't seem to change. Well, and almost never changes. Principal can, but we're going to hold these two constants. So we're going to have absolute cell references for A2 and C2 because those are going to be those two amounts. But we could still change them by just typing different numbers into them. What will change will be all the other bits and pieces. So we want this cell to be defined with that big formula, but using 1 year and 1%. And I don't want to start over from scratch with that formula. That was a big, ugly formula. So instead, let's use the formula from this cell to kind of help us get started. Now, if we just copy that cell, right, if we just do a Control C and then come down here and do Control V, it's going to do two things. It's going to copy the color, but when it copies the formula, remember it's all based on where it is. So it has all these reference things because it doesn't make sense because this one said take something that is 4 to the left of it, and there isn't something 4 to the left of this. So that's not going to work. You don't want to copy the cell. What you want to do is copy the formula. So if you go up here and highlight the formula in the formula bar and hit Control C, then come down here. Sorry. I want to hit Enter just to get out of there. Because if you come down here, it recreates that whole thing. So hit Enter to get out of that formula. And then now come down here and again click in the formula bar and hit Control V and hit Enter. We've now defined this with that formula. So far, so good. Before we go any further, let's go ahead and define or format all of these things as money. Right? We're going to do currency rather than accounting. Just looks better. Okay, we know that 289.99 is wrong, but that's because we copied the formula. And we don't want to use these numbers up here for this. We want to use some of them, but not all of them. Remember, we're going to keep this one always. So A2 is always going to be the right one. So we can make that $sign and $sign because A2 never changes. And then also the number of compounds, N. So anytime you see C2, that's also going to be held constant. All right, we have another C2 over here. So that's held constant. And finally, we have a C2 here. All right, so we've locked A2 in place, C2, C2, and C2. We haven't done anything to B2 or D2 because those are going to change based on where we are in the formula. Okay, but we don't want B2 for the APR for this cell. Instead, we want this one. So we're going to change that to B7. And see how now it's pulling this one in. So over here, this also needs to be B7. And then finally, instead of the number of years being 5, being D2, we need it to be C7. So this thing needs to change to C7, and it doesn't matter that it's lowercase. I normally make them uppercase just because I like the look of it, but it doesn't matter if it's lowercase or uppercase. All right, so now everything should be defined correctly. Uh-oh, we made a mistake, right? Something doesn't seem right according to this. So let's see if we can figure out what we did wrong. Did you guys catch it? I put C7, and I really need C6. All right, so that's the other nice thing about Excel is if you make mistakes, it'll come up with that error and say, hey, something's not working right. All right, so now let's see if that's correct. Is that the answer that the book shows? We don't know. All right, I'll have to edit that out. Okay, awesome. There is our first one. Now, we obviously don't want to do that 59 more times, right? Because there's 60 total squares here. We want to be able to drag and drag. But if I drag this formula over by 1, what's going to change is all of the formulas are going to shift over by 1. This one, the A2 is locked in place, right? All those things are locked. But B7 all of a sudden is going to become C7. It's going to move over 1. So we don't want that. So we want to lock the B in place. So let's lock the B in place. Okay, so we need to lock this one in place as well. All right, and then don't we also need to lock the C6 in place, right? We don't want it moving over by 1, or do we, right? Because when we move it over by 1, don't we want to now take this one, the 2 years? Yeah, so we don't want to lock that one in place. We want to keep it as moving, so it'll become D6. All right, so let's try that. Let's move this over 1, and then click on this, and let's double check and make sure the formula makes sense. Well, look at it, it's using this one and this one and that one and that one. So perfect, it worked. Okay, so let's drag it all the way over, and there's our first row. And again, you can check the last one just to make sure it's making sense. If you click inside the formula, it'll highlight the cells it's using, and it's using 1% APR, it's using 6 years, and it's using the principal and the number at 12. So that all looks good. And now that we've got this whole thing, we want to be able to drag it down. But if we drag it down, something's going to happen, right? If we drag it down, all of a sudden it's going to hold at the wrong place and not shift where it needs to shift. So let's go back to this starting formula in the upper left-hand corner and realize that if I drag it straight down, right, let's just do 1 to see what happens. 25 doesn't seem right, right? Because what's going on? Well, let's click on this and see what's happening. It's shifted down here, but it's now, instead of using 1, it's using that as the number of years. And because we've got 1,256 years, we only have payments of $25. So that's a problem. We can't have it shift down like that, right? So where is that shift happening? Well, obviously it's not the A's, right? The A2s and the C2s. It's this C7 piece. It shouldn't be C7. It should still be C6. So that's a problem. We need that to stay as a 6. All right, so go back up here, and 6 needs to be held in place. Okay, so now let's try it. Let's drag this one down, and that looks better. Okay, well, because we made that change there, don't we also want it to happen here? If this one gets dragged down, it's going to change as well. So we need to refresh these, so to speak. Drag across them again, and you'll notice that the numbers don't change at all. But now when you click on this one, you can see that I now have a $sign in front of that 6. Because we have to stay on this row, so we have to make sure they stay on a 6. Okay, now that we've done that, we should be able to drag everything down, and it should fill in all of our cells. And to double check and make sure that it's correct, if we look here at 6% and 5 years, it is in fact $289.99. And we can see that our table has all the same numbers that their table has. So we've done it right. Right? So now you guys have learned how to use dollar signs in the right places to hold certain aspects of your formula steady. It's, do you need to freeze a row or you do need to freeze a column? Sometimes you need to freeze an entire cell. So if you're going to freeze a row, you put it in front of the number. If you're going to freeze just the column, right, you put it just in front of the letter. And if you're going to freeze the whole cell, you put the dollar sign in front of both the letter and the number. Now let's say you want to kind of investigate what happens with the 5-year loan with different APRs. You want to look at those 10 different APRs and see what the difference in those monthly payments are. You can obviously see what the numbers are, but let's say you wanted to graphically display that so you could present it to somebody else and show them the difference between a 1% up to a 10% APR. Well, you could highlight that column and the column of APRs and insert a table, a chart, and see what goes on from there. All right, so click on 1%, hold the button down, highlight this whole column. If you want to highlight another column, all you have to do is hold down the control button and then highlight that column as well. I think it's the Apple button or some similar button on a Mac. So if you have a Mac, I apologize. I don't know how to do it on that, but I'm sure you can figure out or Google how to highlight 2 different columns in Excel on a Mac. Okay, now that you have those 2 done, if you go up here to Insert, and then if you've got the latest version of Excel, you can do Recommended Charts and just choose the first one. But if you just tell it to put in a normal bar chart, then you'll get this same thing. Right? So I'm just going to move it up here so they're next to each other. Now, if you have an older version of Excel, and I don't know how far back you got to go to lose this Recommended Charts button, but if you only have the Insert columns and bar charts button or any of the kind of older versions where you have to find insert 2-dimensional bar charts, and you do that, you get something that looks drastically different, right? The newer version kind of has some smarter artificial intelligence in it, whereas this one, all it does is it takes both columns of data as separate columns of data, and it graphs them both on the same graph. So these tiny little blue bars that you can barely even see, that's series 1, and all that's doing is it's graphing these numbers. And then the orange bars are graphing these numbers, and it's based everything on percentages because these were percentages. It's a horrible thing. It's all wrong. It's no good. So if you don't have the fancy button, you're going to have to do a lot to this to make it look right, and I'll walk you through that here. All right, so if you've got to go kind of old school with the older versions, what you want to do is highlight just the data, right? Don't highlight both of those columns. So don't highlight the stuff in red, just highlight just the data columns and come up here and insert a 2-dimensional chart. And you're going to get this thing, which you can see is pretty much the same shape, but it's different, right? Down here, instead of percentages, it's just got numbers. The numbers over here are still the same. So basically we need to change how it defines or displays the x-axis. And we can do that by clicking on the Select Data button, which brings up this lovely little box with all sorts of weird stuff. You can see it. This thing now has a little dancing line around it telling you that this is the data that we're actually using to compute our graph. Okay, once this is up, over here you can see the horizontal category, the x-axis labels. We want to edit those. So this is what it does kind of by default. If we click on Edit, we can type things in here, or we can just go over here and highlight that range. And you can see that it's telling us that it's pulling from the car loan tab those cells. And then over here we can see a preview of what they're going to be turned into. Click OK. We can see the preview again here. Click OK there. And now all of a sudden, the bottom has percentages instead of just the numbers 1 through 5. Now that you have it looking like this, there's some, you can do all sorts of interesting formatting things with it. Again, depending on the version of Excel you have. If you got the newest one, you can click over here and you can add things like you can bring in axis titles, so you can title what those things are. You can, you know, bring in a legend. You can mess with the trend line, all sorts of interesting stuff. If you have the older version, then a lot of times up here with the quick layout button, you can change it that way to bring in things, change formats, and kind of mess around that way. I'm going to go with this one because I don't need to label the Y, because the Y is pretty obvious. It's just money, but you could still label it. But it'd be nice to know what this is down here. So if you double click on that, you can change that, right? Again, based on what you have, the version you have, you can change the font and all that kind of stuff. So we can now go up here and select data and the series, right? That's what this was called down here, right? It's just called series 1. If we want to rename that, we can edit that to change it to what we want it to be called. So we want it to be called APR. And now it's called APR. We can also right click on it and change the font. So we can change it to a much bigger size, like 36, let's say. See what that looks like. Yeah, that's good. We can see it. We can really read that, right? You'll notice that it also changed the title. But if you just double click on that, you can change that to whatever you want. Monthly payments, right? For a 5-year loan at $15,000. And again, you can change that by making it bold, changing its size, changing its color, maybe make it red. So you can mess around with all that kind of stuff. Maybe you don't like the fact that they're all it's hard to see the difference because it starts at 0 and really all that's happening is from 250 up. So we can actually adjust that as well. If you click on the y-axis to highlight it and then right click on it, you can format your axes. And then over here, instead of having the minimum start at 0, you can type in 250. And then look at that. Now you can kind of see the difference better. And it highlights what's happening. This also, is one of the ways that you can create quote unquote misleading graphs that we talk about in a lot of stats classes, because this now makes the difference seem far more pronounced than it actually is because you've zoomed in on that difference. So just keep that in mind, that when you see graphs, you should always check to make sure that this actually did in fact start at 0, and it doesn't. So this can be considered a bit of a misleading graph. You can then maybe highlight the lines, so to speak, and just delete those to get rid of them, make it a little bit cleaner. You could put in your axes so you can actually see the X and Y axes better if you wanted to kind of highlight that. The last thing you might want to do is show these axes, right? So we'll right click on it again to format our axes, and if we click on the fill thing, it also brings up the line. We need to make sure the color of our line is black so that we can see it. And then if we want to see the actual tick marks and things, we click on this axis option, and this might look slightly different again if you have a different version, but they're all in there. Just kind of scroll through them and you'll see tick marks. The major one you want on the outside. So now you see that created that. And if we do the same thing, if we right click on the x-axis and do the same thing for that, turn the tick marks on, make them major on the outside, format the line so that we can see it, so it's a color. And now there's our final version. Kind of drag it, make it a little bigger so you can all see it really well. And then that is it for this chapter.